Welcome. This is presentation number 7 in our series, Retrieving Romans. The title for today's presentation is Retrieving Role Models and Retrieving Ecological Role Models. Now, the role model we're talking about here is Abraham. And Abraham is more than an ecological role model. He is the model for the person who has faith in God or who trusts God. But he is also a compelling ecological figure. And we want to retrieve that. So still on the path of retrieval and looking at the story of Abraham. So just to look back where we have come from, chapter 3, and in the bigger context of Romans, the very strange thing that Paul, who writes this letter, was once a persecutor and then he becomes a proclaimer. So how did that happen? Just to revisit that before we proceed. How did that happen? That someone who was determined to stop the preaching of the message of Jesus, he actually ends up to become the foremost proclaimer. No one like him. So what are the possible explanatory models here? Well, we have the old perspective on Paul. That's the Lutheran perspective, you might say, that says that, well, Paul used to think that he had to work his way to heaven or work out his salvation. And then he discovered that salvation is by faith. Paul has a biography like Luther, who has a troubled conscience. That is called the old perspective. But Paul and Luther are not the same. So it doesn't work. So the old perspective does not have sufficient explanatory power for the move from persecutor to proclaimer. What about the new perspective? The new perspective says that Paul actually believed in salvation by faith, by trust in God, that he didn't believe in salvation by work before he came to Jesus. So that's clarifying, that's helpful, but it doesn't really fully explain how he would then become, move from becoming a persecutor to being a proclaimer. So that is also, in my view, inadequate. Then you have Paul within Judaism, that you tie him even closer to Judaism. And there is much to be said for that. There is much of Judaism in Paul. We looked in Romans 1 that Paul travels the world and he tells the Gentiles that you have to believe in the God who revealed himself in the Old Testament. You have to believe and obey the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. Still, though, the explanatory power here is not strong enough. We have one left. We have the apocalyptic perspective that something is revealed to Paul. The Jesus that reveals himself, the Jesus whom he persecuted. That is such a shocking discovery. That is so different. It's bigger than the old perspective, bigger than the new perspective, bigger than Paul within Judaism. The apocalypse that he has in relation to Jesus. And I agree with E.P. Sanders, who says that in Paul, the line doesn't run from plight to solution. I have this need. I am a sinner. I need a savior. In Paul, the line runs from solution to plight. He discovers Jesus. And then he discovers what was wrong after he has discovered the solution. Well, we'll think more about that. But now we're going to talk about Abraham. And the contest over Abraham. Who gets to define the meaning of Abraham, because in these letters, in Romans and Galatians, there is a big contest over Abraham. We read in Romans 4, what are we to say? That we have found Abraham to be our forefather according to the flesh? There is another translation here. What shall we say about Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh? But here in this translation, Paul is saying Abraham is more than our forefather according to the flesh. So he is a kind of faith model. And then when we look at the meaning of this or put it in context, so I say there is a contest over Abraham. On whose side is he in the controversy between Paul and the counter-missionaries? Because they like Abraham too. And they think that Abraham has a certain meaning. And they want to be the ones who define what it means. And then Paul, he is not going to let go of Abraham easily, or to say that the meaning is what the other side says. So, here in Romans chapter 4, an entire chapter devoted to discussing Abraham. And then not only in chapter 4, but also chapter 8, wonderful verse in 8:32, and then he visits Abraham again in chapter 11. So this is quite a bit of print spent on Abraham. And guess what? Surprise! It's exactly the same in Galatians. And we know that in Galatians, the presence of counter-missionaries is really, really very significant. So a fierce contest over ownership of Abraham in these two chapters. And look at the text in Galatians from chapter 3, verse 6 till chapter 4:31. In that book that has only 6 chapters, you have almost 2 chapters all about Abraham. So we cannot overplay or over stress too much how much this means. So here is a painting, an old painting from the 15th century. This is supposed to show how God calls Abraham and tells him, Lech lecha, leave, get up and go forth. Go forth is what that expression means. So the call to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 to go forth. And let's just do a little quick take on the Abraham story. I'm indebted here to a Czech artist in the long ago. This is the 15th century. So here are scenes from the life of Abraham, 16 different scenes. They are too small, so I will blow up a few of them. So here is the call to Abraham to go forth and to leave his home. And I'm sorry. And here is a promise that he will become a blessing and he will multiply and everything will go well, supposedly. And then here is the promise of offspring, that he will have many descendants, and we know that didn't happen right away. And then there are complications on the way. Sarah doesn't have children. And this is a depiction of Sarah, the aging Sarah, coming with the youthful Hagar, for Abraham to have relations with her and get the offspring. That didn't happen. So artists have taken a great interest in this particular scene. And here, another scene, very sad. This is Abraham with Hagar and Ishmael, because there is conflict in the family and he has to send Hagar and Ishmael away. Well, this is not exactly all in Romans. It is actually in Galatians. In chapter 4 in Galatians, there is Ishmael, there is the story of Hagar. So it's not like Paul doesn't know it, even though he doesn't go into detail in Romans. And then, of course, here in Caravaggio's painting, the binding of Isaac, the story that Abraham does get an heir, Isaac, and then God tells him to go and sacrifice him. And sure, this is quite a revolting scene, and but it is part of the Abraham story. Okay, one more thing before we can proceed in our text. Abraham in the post-Pauline world. So how big is Abraham down to our time? And this is not just a digression. I do mean this to be something to be part of the curriculum, as it were. So the most influential Scandinavian, in my view, is Søren Kierkegaard, who died in 1855. He didn't live very long. He had a short and very sad life. But he had studied theology, and he took a great interest in the story of Abraham. He wrote a book about it. It's called Fear and Trembling in English. In Danish, it's called Frygt og Beven. And it is a meditation on the meaning of the sacrifice of Isaac in the story of Abraham. It is a compelling meditation. It is deserving of its reputation. This book influenced Karl Barth, the most influential theologian of the 20th century, Swiss-German theologian, who wrote a book on Romans in 1919, a commentary on Romans, where you feel the echo, you feel the fervor, the nerve, the verve, whatever you want to call it, from Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. And all because of Abraham. Abraham in the post-Pauline world, influencing the 20th century, influencing philosophy, theology, the way we think about all kinds of things. So here is the story of the binding of Isaac, or the sacrifice of Isaac, and as a major feature in the story. And we will try to sort this out. I may want to pause a minute here and recommend my own book, God of Sense and Traditions of Nonsense. In chapter 9 of this book, I have written about the story of the binding of Isaac, and I have looked at it again recently, thinking, did you get it right? It was very difficult to do. And I would just mention that because to see how these things, the meaning of these things, it might be good to read the story in Genesis and ponder that, and then read Romans, what it means in the context of Romans. We are in Romans 4, and this is what we read. For if Abraham was set right through works, he has a boast, but not in reference to God. For what does the scripture say? Now Abraham believed in God, and it was reckoned to him as one set right. This is in my translation. I use the term set right instead of justify, and I will explain that in not today, but in our next presentation. But there is a commentary on this text here. This is a quotation from Genesis 15:6. So Paul is quoting Genesis, remembering the Abraham story. And then Rolf Rentorf, a leading German Old Testament scholar, he says something that I wish us to remember. The linguistic structure of the verse, Genesis 15:6, leaves the subject of this second half of the verse open. According to the traditional interpretation, God counted Abraham's faith as righteousness. But in medieval Jewish interpretation, we already find the view that it is Abraham who recognizes and acknowledges God's promise as an expression of God's righteousness. Who is counted righteous here? God counts Abraham righteous. That's the way we read it usually. But In the older way of reading it, it is Abraham who counts God to be righteous. He counts God to be reliable. And the essence of Abraham's trust then is the trustworthiness of God, and not simply Abraham trusting. See that? I will spell it out in a little more. Abraham believed in God's faithfulness and confirmed it, as it were, by acknowledging it. This is very basic. Here is the way it could be illustrated. Let's see here. I need to stand here so you can see the text. So here is one option. So he, because this is what the text says in Genesis, he, that is clearly Abraham. Abraham believed the Lord. So that first part of the sentence is unproblematic. And then the way we usually read it, and then we read, and he, that is to say the Lord. Abraham believed the Lord, and he, that is to say the Lord, reckoned it to him, to Abraham, as one who was set right. So here Abraham is the subject, and here God is the subject. But this is the other way of reading it. And he, Abraham, believed the Lord. And he, not God, but Abraham, reckoned him, that is to say God, as trustworthy. Have I made that clear enough? Those options are clearly there. And I have a great friend at Loma Linda University, Bernard Taylor, who is an expert on biblical languages, on linguistics, and he has invested in this interpretation quite a bit and written a paper about it, landing on this interpretation here, that Abraham believed the Lord and Abraham reckoned God to be trustworthy. Does it matter? It matters some. Even if we say that it is Abraham the believer we are seeing in the second half here, that he is reckoned to be righteous in God's eyes, he is righteous only because he acknowledges that God is trustworthy, God is reliable, God is faithful. Let's read on. Now to the one who works, his pay is not reckoned as a gift, but as an obligation. But to the one who does not work, yet has faith in the one who sets right the impious, his faith is reckoned as righteousness, just as also David pronounces the blessing upon the person to whom God reckons righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose iniquities have been forgiven, and whose sins have been covered up. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will in no wise reckon. So here there is works and not works. And the question is what to make of that. How does this work out? What kind of work are we talking about here? Is it a person who has to be pious in a certain way? Or could it refer to some other notion of work? So the usual thinking here is that, someone has this belief that they have to be saved by works, by earning salvation. So your standing before God is earned and transactional. God, I did this and you owe me. Because I did that, I was good and you owe me now. So the idea that Judaism had this view has been challenged by the new perspective on Paul. E.P. Sanders and others saying that Judaism did not hold that view, that you have to earn your salvation. So what could the works be then? What sort of works is all this commotion about? Well, it could be specific religious practices such as circumcision. You have to do those works to be accepted. You have to be circumcised. You have to have some observances that are necessary. And there are some terms here, terms in Galatians and terms in Romans that probably should be seen as shorthand for group identity. And the group identities we're talking about are groups with Paul in one of the groups and his counter-missionaries in the other group. So let's see how this works. Some in one group, they have the identity based on work. Hosoi ex ergo nomo, that's the group that wants you to be circumcised. They want you to do that kind of work. And then you have a group that has an identity based on the faithfulness of God, and the shorthand for that is hoi ek pisteos, those who are of the faithfulness of God group. So two groups, two identities. Let's read more text and then see if we can pull this together. Is this blessing therefore upon the... See here? Now we are talking about circumcision. Is this blessing therefore upon the circumcision or also upon the uncircumcised foreskin? For we say that the faith was reckoned to Abraham as one who had been set right. And here is a depiction, a pretty gory depiction of God instructing the patriarch that he has to be circumcised. And he does it himself. You know, this is not a minor procedure on an adult, you know, and you have to think about the old days with sterility and sort of hygiene. So not a joke. So see how he narrows the options here. How yes, you can say contrived the discussion seemed. How therefore was it reckoned? While he was in the state of circumcision or in uncircumcised foreskin? So was Abraham in a right relationship with God before he was circumcised? Or was he in a right relationship with God after? Before or after? Here, before or after? So not in circumcision, but in uncircumcised foreskin. You need to hear the other side, that other group here. They say that Abraham is in a right relationship with God only when he has been circumcised. And Paul will argue he was in a right relationship with God before the works, before he was circumcised. Was it before or after? Not in circumcision, but in uncircumcised foreskin. So here we have to look at the calendar. Which day was it? Was it on Tuesday when he was still uncircumcised? Or was it after his circumcision? This before and after argument is quite specific, quite intriguing. There is an argument just like it in Galatians, and it seems even more forced. It seems even more strange. So let's look at this and compare. In Romans, there is a before or after in relation to circumcision. In Galatians, there is a discussion about seed or seeds. And let's try to do it. Here, reading now in Galatians, now the promises were made to Abraham and to his seed. It does not say and to seeds, as of many, but it says and to your seed, that is to one person, who is Isaac. No, who is Christ. It doesn't say seeds. With Isaac and Jacob and the descendants defined ethnically. It says seed as to one, and that one is Christ. This is quite strange. And here, because the word seed can is a word that has seed. You think seed, you think one seed when you hear the word seed? Or can you, just by me saying the word seed, think that there are many seeds? You can. This word in singular can have a plural meaning. So, and this is why it's so strange, because it seems like a pretty contrived argument. It doesn't say seeds as too many. There is no linearity here. It doesn't even mean that that Christ is a figure in a line. He is a punctiliar figure. It doesn't say seeds as too many, it says seed as to one, and that one is Christ. So let me see if I can spell this out. From a word in singular that can have a plural referent, the word seed can refer to many. Paul transforms the telling of Israel's story. Abraham's singular seed is not Isaac, but Christ. That's in Galatians. And by this logic, Abraham is by this logic a punctiliar figure, as if to erase the history between him and the arrival of Jesus. And third point, this is an apocalyptic perception. Apocalyptic in contrast to historical linearity. Now, these are very strange arguments, and they only have meaning if you understand that there are some people arguing on the other side. In Romans, the counter-missionaries, they say that you are in a right relationship with God after you have been circumcised. Paul says it isn't after, it is before. And in Galatians, it's even more radical. His argument is even more radical. It's not before or after circumcision. It is whether there is linearity, whether there is ethnicity and circumcision as a marker of that mixture of ethnic identity and faith identity. And Paul will, under pressure, will say, well, guess what? We're taking out linearity completely. And we're making Abraham a punctiliar figure. There is Abraham, and between Abraham and Jesus, not much to talk about. See how radical that argument is. Maybe he walks it back a little in Romans, but it's quite strange. Let's read on now, back in Romans chapter 4. And so before or after he has talked about, and then he says what the after the circumcision means. And he received a sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness through faith that he had while in uncircumcised foreskin, that he might become the father of all who have faith while in foreskin, that righteousness might be reckoned to them, and the father of circumcision, not only to those who are circumcised, but also to those who walk in the steps of the uncircumcised foreskin faith of our father Abraham. And I'm using the translation by Robert Jewett. Now, circumcision, here these are Egyptian depictions, and it's quite possible that circumcision is not just something that happens in relation to Judaism, in relation to Abraham. Maybe other cultures did it too, but you can see that it is quite a procedure. It's not a joke. So let's look at the meaning of it and in relation to the Old Testament. So here we are going to read the Genesis text that introduces circumcision in the Old Testament. Every male among you shall be circumcised. This is God talking to Abraham. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Throughout your generations, every male among you shall be circumcised when he is 8 days old. Better to do it when they are little, including the slave born in your house and the one bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. so shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Does it seem like circumcision is necessary? Is it optional? It's not optional. Paul's counter-missionaries have a strong argument. Paul wants to take that away, and you see how he does it by saying that Abraham was in a right relationship with God before circumcision. And he takes it further. He says that there is Abraham's singular seed, and it's not Isaac, it is Christ. So when we think about it in medical terms, of course, we see that this is has a theological meaning, but it is a medical procedure, a surgical procedure on the male genitals. Only males are circumcised. Here in a little less sort of graphic illustration, and then let me make a couple of points, pros and cons in relation to circumcision. In adults, it is a significant surgical procedure. It is still a significant surgical procedure in an adult, and many people have botched surgeries. And circumcision could be a deterrent to mission. Let's say that Paul wants to preach to all the Gentile world and bring them in, and then he says, well, guess what? Yes, you have to believe in Jesus, and we have to send you to the operating room. You also have to be circumcised. That could be a deterrent to mission. Say, well, I believe in Jesus, but I don't really want anyone to, do that surgical procedure, and maybe they didn't have anesthesia. So that could be a deterrent. The bigger reason, though, is not the pain of circumcision. The bigger reason is that circumcision fails as a meaning-making symbol. What relationship is there between believing in Christ, crucifixion, resurrection? What relationship is there between that story and doing a surgical procedure on the male genitals? It's not a meaning-making symbol. Baptism, burial, and resurrection is meaningful, but not circumcision. And then also, as Paul says in Romans 2:29, it externalizes a transformation meant to be internal. Circumcision of the heart, that is meaningful. Circumcision of the foreskin isn't. So those are pros and cons, and now we move on. So Romans 4:19-22, as not having weakened in faith, he considered his own body already dead since he was about 100 years old. He also considered the deadness of Sarah's womb. Yet with regard to the promise of God, no doubt made him waver in unfaith, but he was empowered in his faith, giving glory to God and fully convinced that the one who had promised is capable also to do it. For this reason it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Paul, in some ways here, makes Abraham's story neater than it really was. It was probably as though he did waver a little. Again, here is Sarah and Hagar and Abraham. And there is that painful story. Here, Abraham pleads with Sarah not to let him send. I think that's how it is to be understood. Maybe I'm interpreting wrong, but there is a scene of Abraham asking that he shouldn't have to send Ishmael away. So there are some issues here, and also issues in relation to other partners for Sarah in the story. So reading on, for the promise that he would inherit the world did not come to Abraham and to his descendants through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. So Abraham will inherit the law, and why will inherit the world? And why is that? Because he is set right by God's faithfulness. That's how I think that should be understood. the righteousness of faith here is shorthand for the story of God's faithfulness. That is how he becomes, inherits. Okay, the last part of it has to do with ecology. Now Abraham as ecological role model. And we jump to Genesis for that. We know that Abraham knows the Genesis story, that Paul, when he writes Romans, he knows the Genesis story. And we are using now for the ecology part, a part of Genesis about the story of Abraham and Lot. Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. Now Lot, who went with Abraham, who had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them living together. For their possessions were so great that they could not live together, and there was strife between the herders of Abraham's livestock and the herders of Lot's livestock. So here we are with Abraham and Lot, and they will separate here shortly. Then Abraham said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herders and my herders, for we are kindred. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." So here they will separate. There is a division. They go each their separate ways. Abraham generously offers Lot the first choice. He is not acquisitive. He is not possessive. And this makes him an interesting ecological figure. We read on. Lot looked about him and saw that the plain of the Jordan was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. It's paradise. That's what he's describing. In the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan. And Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abraham settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the plain and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Here they stand in my illustration, and they look at which land, and Lot says, "This looks like the best part, and I will go there." And Abraham says, "That's fine with me. I'm not going to contest that." Abraham and Lot in ecologic terms. So what are they? How do they line up? Abraham, he is a sojourner. Lot will eventually be a settled person and be a citizen of Sodom and Gomorrah. The priority of Abraham is clearly spiritual. Lot's priority is material. He moves into the best land and he gravitates more and more toward Sodom, which is not a good idea if you have a spiritual interest. Abraham's disposition is unselfish. Well, there is an element clearly of self-interest in Lot. Ideology, he's very accommodating. You choose first, it's okay. Here, Lot more acquisitive, and the orientation of Abraham is communal. Let's maintain peace. Let's not have conflict. Lot's ideology, orientation, is more individualistic, clearly. So, someone has said, though, and this is kind of, so I have now made Abraham to be quite an interesting ecological figure, and then I came across this comment on Abraham by Aldo Leopold, who is a very significant voice on ecology in America. He died in 1948, and he wrote this book, the Asant County Almanac, that I have in my possession. And he says this: conservation is getting nowhere because it is incompatible with our Abrahamic concept of land. We abuse the land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, yes, that's correct, we may begin to use it with love and respect. So here I want to have Abraham and claim him as an ecological role model. And although Leopold, major figure in ecological ideology, he says we can't do that because Abraham treats land as a commodity. He does it because there is a text in Genesis. When Sarah dies, Abraham wants to have a burial spot for Sarah. Where can he bury her? So he talks to the people who live there, the Hittites, and the owners of the land, and he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, if you will listen to me, I will give you the price for the field. Accept it from me so that I may bury my dead there. So Abraham is in a dire straits. He needs a place to bury his wife. It's not like he's treating land as commodity. That is a nasty reading of the story. He doesn't do any such thing. It is the other person, the seller, who in some ways treats the land as commodity. And then we hear the seller will say, my lord, listen to me, a piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. That is a very high price. Everyone agrees that this is really highway robbery. But that's what he will demand of Abraham. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. He pretends it's a low price. It isn't. Abraham agreed with Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. But it's not, Abraham is just trying to get a place to bury Sarah. After this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, facing Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So here is the end of Abraham's story, or toward the ending of Abraham's story. Yes, he will bury his wife Sarah, the mother of Isaac, and he will be moving on and expecting bigger things to happen in the future. But we should not say of him that he treats land as commodity and blame that on him. In modern agriculture, now after Abraham, we have land as commodity. I think I will skip this slide just in the interest of time, and then say that we do have land as commodity. We are selling land, real estate, land as commodity, in a way that is quite alien to biblical ideology, and that is not Abraham's fault in the least. So we have ecology and land, and ecologists, they want land to be distributed as much as possible and to have the person who farms the land to take care of it. So in the Old Testament later, after Abraham, this is a text from Moses, we hear that God says to Moses, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me you are but aliens and tenants. So with all these for sale signs that we have, and including the for sale sign here on farmland, we have a biblical idea of land ownership. Who owns the land? God owns the land, and we are just aliens and tenants. And that is actually how things are in the Abraham story, dividing land that isn't theirs. When Abraham is so magnanimous toward Lot, maybe it is because he has that sense of his own relation to the land. This is not my land. I am just a tenant here. And let's sum it up. Abraham as ecological role model here at the end. Abraham receives a land promise, but he never possesses the land. He is never settled there. He's always a migrant, and he even has to stay for a while in Egypt. The strange adjudication of before and after in Romans, and of seed and seeds in Galatians, in that adjudication, Abraham's life is that of a migrant, and his faith is future-oriented. Land now in our time counts as commodity, real estate, perhaps the most critical element in the world economy, with no regard for ecological concerns. And here is my last point. In the Old Testament, the land is mine. With me, you are but aliens and tenants. This is the enduring, institutionalized expression of Abraham's eco-sensitive faith.